What is up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Danelle Hallan, and I am back with another true crime video. And don't forget that if you prefer to listen to your content in podcast form, everything that's here on my channel is also on my podcast, Crime Bit with Danelle Hallan. You can look it up pretty much anywhere you like to enjoy your podcast, and it should be there for you. Today, we are discussing a case that just hit its 14-year anniversary. It's the case of Roberta, who went by Bobbie Miller. She was a beautiful and vibrant woman that had her life cut short, leaving behind endless questions and a relentless pursuit for justice. She was a devoted mom, she was a loyal friend, and a loved member of her community. In the wake of a nasty divorce that she had finally just gotten through, Bobbie had started to rebuild her life. She moved into a new home, she enrolled in college, and she was embracing new opportunities. But unfortunately, on Halloween night 2010, tragedy struck Gilford, New Hampshire. Bobbie was found brutally murdered in her own home alongside her dog, who suffered the same fate. The investigation that ended up following her death was filled with a lack of resources, missteps, finger pointing, and way more questions than answers. And so now her case has joined over 130 other cold cases that are just sitting in boxes at the Attorney General's office, right beside well-known Mara Murray. So Bobbie's brother Ken has since become a tireless advocate, demanding accountability and answers from investigators that are supposed to be bringing her justice. But despite the passing of 14 years, her family is still met with silence and the very real possibility that her killer may never be brought to justice. Her case is a story of a stolen life and a system that has failed her and her family at every turn, one that we've unfortunately heard time and time again. So let's get into the details. Bobbie Miller was born on September 25th, 1956, into an already bustling big family. She had 4 sisters and 1 brother. And when she was just 7 years old, her family decided to move into the most idyllic farmhouse that I have ever seen on Amherst Street in the suburb of Bedford, New Hampshire, because they needed a little more wiggle room. And this was such an amazing place to raise kids. Bobbie was able to help care for all of the animals that they had, and she developed a love for the outdoors. She helped to raise chickens and pigs and ducks, but the ponies were always her favorite. And given the constant activity at the home, unsurprisingly, it became a magnet for all of the kids' friends. And Bobbie, with her fearless spirit and her hearty laugh, was always the center of the action. She was very charismatic and beautiful. She had a huge personality. Her list of hobbies and interests also made it really easy for her to have something in common with just about everyone. She loved to ride dirt bikes. She loved hiking and sailing, any sort of outdoor adventure, and she was all in. Being raised on a farm, she wasn't scared to get out there. She wasn't scared to get dirty, but she also had this beautiful and calm artistic side to her. She enjoyed writing and sewing, and she had a real knack for stained glass. She loved to create these intricate masterpieces for her family to give as gifts, and those are things that they are still able to treasure to this day. Little pieces of Bobbie that she left behind. And while growing up with that many siblings definitely has its challenges, at the end of the day, her siblings remember her as their protector. She was always ready to stand up for them, a wild child with a tough exterior over a heart of gold. Bobbie also had a special place in her father's heart and knew that he ran a tight ship, but she was the master at navigating the strict rules, okay? Bobbie leaned in on her charm. She was always this obedient daughter, following all the rules. She would come home 5 minutes before curfew. And from her dad's perspective, she was just like the most ideal, well-behaved child. But while her dad wasn't watching, that rebellious streak of hers came through, because the moment the lights went out, she was heading out of her window to continue her fun. Her teenage years were just a whirlwind of back road drives with her brother, pushing the limits, and really embracing the freedom of youth. She genuinely did live every moment to the fullest. Bobbie eventually went on to graduate from West High School in 1975 in Manchester, and that free spirit of hers swept her away from home right away. On a whim and with no plan whatsoever, she and her friend moved to Arizona. That was like the most Bobbie thing for her to do. It seemed like she was never afraid to try anything. She was never afraid to take a risk and had full confidence that she was capable of figuring things out along the way. And that's exactly what she did. And after a year full of these new adventures, Bobbie came back home. She moved in with a few friends in the larger city of Manchester and took on waitressing jobs to get by. And this is where she ended up meeting Gary Miller. Gary was a year younger than her, and she was immediately impressed with his ambition. He was working as a bouncer in Manchester by night, and during the day, he was a hard-working mechanic. And Gary was eager to start his life. He wanted to become a businessman. He had huge hopes and dreams, and Bobbie fell in love with him for it. By 1981, the two got married and decided to head out to the Midwest so that Gary could continue working on his dream. And by 1984, they welcomed their first child, a daughter named Jennifer, and shortly after this, their son, Jonathan. And now, with this growing family, they decided they wanted to head back to their roots. Gary and Bobbie settled into a home on 82 Haynes Hill Road in the quaint lake town of Wolfboro, New Hampshire. And their new home was only about an hour away from Bedford, so Bobbie was still so close to her family, and they fell in love with this community. Gary successfully went on to open 3 businesses. He had 2 auto dealerships and a tire shop, and I believe one of those businesses was actually across the border in Maine. Meanwhile, Bobbie became a well-known figure in the community. Her days were filled with raising their children. That was her top priority. It was what she lived for. And when she wasn't doing that, she was exploring the beauty of their town and lending a hand to everyone in need. She would do anything for anyone. Her daughter Jennifer said in an interview that there was one point where she came home and her bed was gone, and Bobbie was like, well, someone else needed it more. She knew they weren't hard on money. She would be able to provide whatever she needed to her family. So if someone else needed something more, without hesitation, she was going to give it. She drove her elderly neighbor to church every single Sunday like clockwork. She had a list of driveways to shovel when it would snow for those who couldn't. It seemed that her kindness and her generosity really knew no limits. And when their kids finished up high school and were moving on to bigger things, she decided to start taking on jobs. She worked at a local hardware store to stay busy, and I think there was like one other place that she may have worked at a little bit further in the future. But behind closed doors, her life was starting to fall apart. It looked idyllic and beautiful from the outside, but there were cracks under the surface. Gary's businesses had created an ever-growing pressure, and the challenges of that and just a long-term marriage, and the kids have moved out, dynamics are shifting. It started to create a wedge between the couple. And in June of 2007, after 26 years of marriage, the couple decided to separate. Bobbie's family said that they were shocked when they heard this news because to them, Bobbie and Gary's relationship seemed unbreakable. Gary was always well loved by Bobbie's family, and it was the same way the other way around, but time had taken its toll and it seemed there really was no saving it. So by September of 2007, Bobbie filed for divorce. According to those that knew them best, the divorce was far from pretty. The complications of figuring out what to do with these several businesses, and not just their main home, but they also had a cabin in Acton, Maine, created a lot of challenges and disagreements. I can't imagine that it's easy to financially and emotionally liquidate a 26-year marriage. And I feel like when you go through any sort of legal process, even if you have the strongest bond with someone, it is bound to start to tear things apart at some point. So after 3 long years of mediation and back and forth, on August 13th, 2010, their divorce was finalized. Bobbie had received their home in Wolfboro, and Gary received their cabin in Acton, Maine. And as per the agreement, Bobbie was supposed to sell their home, their family home, and Gary was supposed to sell his 2 remaining businesses, and the assets would be split 50-50. So it was a pretty clean agreement here. And at this point, Bobbie was determined to forge a new path for herself. It had been years of trying to navigate this divorce. I am sure it just made whatever feelings they had that caused their marriage to split become even worse. And so she really just wanted to wash her hands of it. She wanted to move on. And so, just days after their divorce finalized, she bought a house. She moved into a charming little ranch home in Gilford, New Hampshire. It was a cute little lake town on the shores of Lake Winnipesaukee. She also had decided to enroll in Granite State College to study business because at this point, her whole life had been dedicated to being a wife, being a mother, and now she had to have some way to support herself. And like I said, she wasn't scared to try anything. So she wanted to go and get a business degree. She was embracing a new life, a new adventure filled with unknowns. She also adopted a golden lab to keep her company, and she frequently spent time with her son Jonathan, who lived in Gilford as well. So this transition seemed to be a very good one for her. The following month, on September 25th, 2010, Bobbie was celebrating her 54th birthday, and she decided to throw a party in her new home. She welcomed friends and family, and they were going to celebrate not just her birthday, but this new house and this new chapter of her life. But just a month after that, and only 2 months after the divorce was finalized and she bought her new home, on Halloween night of 2010, this new life was stolen from her. Bobbie had spent that entire weekend enjoying those around her. Friday night, October 29th, she went out on a date, and Saturday, October 30th, she decided to go out to dinner with her friend named Diane. And this was someone that she had actually met through the business program at Granite State. The two of them went to O Steaks and Seafood on Lake Apiche before heading back to Bobbie's home to watch a movie, and Diane left around 1 a.m. and Bobbie called it a night. Now, the following day of October 31st, the day that it's believed she was murdered, she spoke to both of her kids that day. She spoke to her mom on the phone, and she seemed to them to be in great spirits. She didn't have any plans for that night. Her neighborhood in general wasn't really one to celebrate Halloween, so she didn't expect or plan to get any trick-or-treaters. It was just going to be a mellow day. She had a paper to turn in at midnight, and she planned to spend the rest of the day building window boxes for her new home. She also spoke to everyone excitedly about how she was working on her plans to turn her garage into a stained glass studio. By 5 p.m. that night, Bobbie made a quick trip to the local Lowe's. It was about 5 miles away, where she was captured on surveillance footage. And little did anyone know, this would be the last known image of Bobbie alive. Everything from this point on is still a mystery, even all of these years later. The following day, November 1st, 2010, a distressing call came into Gilford 911 around 4 or 4:30 p.m. It was Jonathan Miller, and he had just found his mom and her beloved dog dead in the kitchen of her home. Police swarmed the quiet neighborhood, ultimately shutting down the road due to all of the activity, and right away, the scene was painting a very grim picture. Bobbie had been shot twice with, of all things, a shotgun. One time in her face, and then the next in the back of the head. And her dog had unfortunately suffered the exact same fate as her. The brutality of this attack suggested that this was something personal. Being shot with a shotgun is horrific, you guys. It does unimaginable damage. There was no question that that first shot killed her. So why would someone shoot her a second time unless it was purely out of rage? And the same thing with the dog. While Jonathan was speaking to police and they were trying to navigate how any of this happened to Bobbie, Jennifer ended up being notified of her mother's death as well. And being states away in California, she started her race to get to her mom and her race for answers. But unfortunately, Bobbie's mom and the rest of her family wouldn't find out about her death until the following morning. And the way they found out about it is so disappointing. They found out about it through the news. Bobbie's mother, Madeline, felt her heart sink that morning of November 2nd as she watched a newscaster speak about a woman and a dog brutally murdered in the area her daughter lived in Gilford. And even without the name being released, she just knew. She knew that was Bobbie and something awful had happened. Imagine you lose your daughter to murder and you find out on TV. The investigation got off to a very slow start. The local police were allegedly stretched thin at this point with another shooting that occurred nearby. There was also a higher profile case that required several officers to spend their time testifying in court, and so there was not a lot of manpower to go towards investigating whatever happened to Bobbie. And even with the state police bringing in their major crimes unit, there really wasn't much movement. Country Club Road, the road she lived off of, remained closed for almost a week. And reporters, when they went to try to figure out what was going on, were met with absolute silence from authorities. And as you can imagine, this caused the public to panic. Even some local government officials were apparently kept in the dark about what was going on, and it led to some of them coming together to write a strong letter demanding answers from the local authorities. Why was nothing being said about what happened to Bobbie? Why was the public not being comforted? It was a really scary situation. And it was even worse almost because at this point, police had released that it was a suspicious death. So people knew something was up, but got nothing afterwards. There was no reassuring press conference. There were no more details. There was nothing. Back at Bobbie's home, where they were slowly chipping away at the investigation, they found that there were no signs of forced entry, which was just adding to the theory that this was something personal. Bobbie had either let someone in or someone had a key and let themselves in. However, it wasn't really possible to know if maybe Bobbie just left her doors unlocked and it was a stranger jumping on an opportunity. But with all of the other information they have, the way that she had been murdered, it just didn't seem that was the most likely. There also was no sign that this was a robbery gone wrong. They found, I think it was over $20,000 in cash and checks inside of Bobbie's home, and none of it had been taken. All of her personal and valuable belongings were still there untouched. Also, something that was very strange, at least in my opinion, was that neither of the two neighbors that lived less than 200 feet away heard the 4 gunshots, and not just regular gunshots, but shotgun blasts ring out that night. Nobody saw any strange activity. The more that was uncovered, just the more it seemed this was a very deliberate and planned and targeted attack. With this information, authorities were able to calm the public. They gave them bare minimum to just make sure they knew they weren't at risk of being attacked by a serial killer or someone running around the community. But this brought no relief to Bobbie's family. Investigators at this point started to question those that knew Bobbie to try to put together a timeline and figure out who may want to harm her. And it wasn't even until a year later that they publicly announced that they believed she was murdered sometime between 4 p.m. on Halloween and 4 p.m. on November 1st. And honestly, I have no idea why it took them that long to release that critical information, because from the information I told you before, you'd know that she was with a friend that Saturday night until 1 a.m. She spoke to numerous family members that Sunday and was seen on surveillance footage that I don't think was just lingering around for a year. They also had information that showed that she never turned her paper in at midnight on Halloween. So I feel like they had plenty of information suggesting that she was murdered sometime that night. So I don't know why it took them a year to confirm this to the public. And when you're relying on tips and you're wanting people to look in a specific time frame, information like that being released really, really matters. And as they continued their investigation, it pretty quickly focused on one specific person that I'm sure you are all already assuming, and that's Gary. It wasn't necessarily odd that authorities decided to focus in on him first. Not only statistically is it more likely that a partner or a family member has something to do with a homicide, but Gary and Bobbie had also just come out of a very, very contentious divorce. And as of a week or two prior, more pretty big issues had arisen. Like, they thought they came out of the woods, they were ready to go their separate ways, and then it was just more of a shitstorm. Gary filed a motion against Bobbie, claiming that she was not upholding the agreed upon divorce proceedings. Bobbie, like I said, had been given their home in Wolfboro, and the agreement was that she would sell it and split it with Gary 50-50. And she hadn't done that yet. But it seemed that the real issue here was due to their taxes. The couple had filed jointly in 2009, and Bobbie had in those months failed to pay her share of it. And after fees, it was nearing $70,000 at this point. And so Gary and his attorney were accusing Bobbie of purposely failing to hold up her end in order to emotionally and financially ruin Gary. They claim that she should have the money to pay for all these things because over those 3 years of the divorce proceedings, she had been paid out around $1 million. And so they thought that she either had the money and was refusing to pay, which goes hand in hand with her trying to ruin him, or she had squandered the money away. And so there is yet another civil court matter on both of their hands. Bobbie, however, came back back, saying that she simply didn't have the money. She hadn't squandered it away, but instead she had owed over $100,000 in legal fees. She was still paying her living expenses daily. She hadn't had an income. She was paying for college and for her kids because she had no way of getting a good income without that. She had still been helping to pay for business expenses. So she had so much money going out and no money coming in other than that. So I'm sure both of them at this point were incredibly angry with each other and frustrated and didn't want to have to go through this all over again. So the hearing for that particular motion ended up being set for the first week of November, and she just so happened to be killed the weekend before that. When authorities had gone and spoken to all of Bobbie's family members, they asked them if they believed there was any way Gary could potentially be involved. And everyone except for their daughter Jennifer apparently claimed they believed it was possible. Bobbie's mother went on to tell authorities that she had been fearful of him, and there was actually an email found that Bobbie had sent to Gary just 2 days before her murder, and it also supported this idea that she was scared. Bobbie called him out on his manipulation, saying that he was filled with a bottomless hate, and she was terrified of the lengths that he was willing to go to in order to ruin her life. And on that same day that she sent this email saying she was scared of him and that he was awful and a bottomless pit of hate, there was another coincidental incident. Friday, October 29th, their cabin that they once shared that now belonged to Gary in Acton, Maine, burned to the ground. A neighbor had apparently seen Gary and his new wife leave the cabin earlier that day. And then at around 9:30 p.m., he was outside at his grill and he looked off and saw this flickering light over on Gary's property. And right away, he knew it looked like a fire. So he attempted to call 911, but he had no service. So he ran to a neighbor who managed to call the fire department. And it took them 6 hours to stop the blaze. This particular cabin worked with a propane heater. So there was a propane tank. And in order to prevent combustion, which would basically explode the entire house and surrounding vicinity, there was a vent open to release some of that propane in a controlled way to hopefully avoid combustion. And so this meant firefighters could not get close because while that may work, it doesn't all the time. And so they were working to get this fire out from afar. And so 6 hours later, they finally managed to get it out, but the house was a complete loss at this point. And so a fire investigator came, the fire marshal, and by that morning, they were able to determine that this had been arson. Someone had poured gasoline all over the front porch of Gary's cabin and threw a match on it, igniting the house. But at this point, nobody was sure if Bobbie had been made aware of this fire at the time of her death. I think several of her family members had conversations about it, and in order to prevent her more stress, had specifically said to not tell her. There were dozens of reasons at this point that Gary might want to harm Bobbie in the authorities' eyes. Maybe the angry email from Bobbie led him to believe that she set his home on fire, so there was retaliation, or maybe the email alone was enough to set him off. A few of Bobbie's family members had also said that he had been violent in the past, so this leaned into the theory. And I don't know if it was ever anything directly physical toward Bobbie, but I do know he had punched holes in walls allegedly. But still, there was more. Maybe he was worried that he would have to come up with the $70,000 for the taxes. I mean, the list was really just endless. Gary was brought in because of this, and he remained cooperative with the police. He was able to give them an alibi of being with his new wife. They were able to confirm he was far away from Gilford when this happened. He never obtained a lawyer or acted in any way that would suggest guilt in the eyes of others. And as a quick side note, I really don't like that rhetoric. It's something that I used to believe all the time, that it was really suspicious when someone got a lawyer. But the more I have been educated, thanks to this channel, getting a lawyer does not point to guilt. It points to knowing how to protect yourself from a really messed up legal system. So if you, for any reason, hopefully never, are in a position where you are being questioned by the police, always get a lawyer no matter what, okay? They're there to protect you. It's okay. You don't look guilty. You're doing what's right for you. So anyways, that aside, Gary also went a step further and agreed to take a polygraph test. And the results were never publicly released. Shocker, I know. But it seems, based on authorities' behavior afterwards, that he likely passed because they put their attention elsewhere. Over the next few months, the police continued to remain tight-lipped, leaving Bobbie's family with a growing and understandable sense of frustration. They wouldn't communicate about what evidence was found, any results of forensic testing, possible suspects. They left them completely in the dark. They didn't say if they thought that the arson was possibly connected to Bobbie's death. I mean, not a single detail was shared under the excuse of an ongoing investigation. And I completely agree that some things have to be protected, but this was everything. So for all anyone knew, I mean, there may have been a disgruntled employee or a businessman that got screwed when Gary had to sell his businesses. Maybe the arson and the murder was someone's way of getting back at both of them. Bobbie had also been dating, so had one of the men that she met had bad intentions and everything else was just a coincidence. Authorities had even shown one of her family members a photo of this unknown man that they thought might be connected to the case, but to this day, they failed to mention this person again. They really were left to just mass speculation. And I talk about this all the time. Like, the more details you get out about something, the more it may answer questions and rule out certain possibilities. And obviously the public's going to do what the public is going to do, but these families are also wondering the exact same thing, if not more. And that's an awful way to live. Actually, there were just all these questions and nobody was helping to answer them. And then 6 months into the investigation, things took a very unexpected turn. Authorities announced that they had received tips from 2 or 3 people that had sparked new interviews and investigative pathways, but they didn't elaborate on what exactly this meant. And at the same time, Bobbie's family, who was forced to do their own thing, decided to put up a $50,000 reward. Gary was working very closely with her family at this point to help put up posters and billboards and push for answers now that the focus was off of him. And they thought that this would get someone to come forward. Because unfortunately, it takes public interest to bring in tips. And when police release nothing, the media doesn't report, which means public interest is gone, and with it goes all possible leads. A mass effort began to put up posters to announce the reward all over, and Ken, Bobbie's brother, began to notice after a while that some of the posters they put up were being taken down. And it was beyond the point that this was just like an occasional poster torn down from kids that have absolutely no sense of respect. This was very purposeful. So Ken decided to put up more posters along with a camera in one of the main locations that I guess they were disappearing. The camera was tied to the base of a tree and was set to send pictures to Kenny's phone of anyone approaching the sign. And since one of the only people that would benefit from tearing signs like this down would be someone essentially wanting Bobbie to disappear and people to not know about this reward, it could bring in a new lead. But shortly after this camera was set up, it stopped sending Ken photographs. And so at this point, he thought maybe it just ran out of battery. So he decided to go out to refresh it. And that's not at all what he found, okay? It was quickly apparent the batteries were not the problem. Someone instead had attempted to destroy the camera. And that's not even the worst part about what he found. Leaning against the tree where the camera was now a large plywood sign, and written on it in huge letters was "F.U. Kenny." No stranger was doing this, and that matched the belief that whoever killed Bobbie knew her personally, and now it's become personal when it comes to putting out information to help get this case solved. The camera had in fact been smashed, but thankfully, Ken noticed that it had only broken the antenna. The camera itself was fine. It had still been taking pictures and storing them in the device. It just hadn't sent them out. So that meant that they probably captured who did this. Ken went to look through all of the pictures, and 3 of them showed something so unbelievable. It showed Bobbie's son, Jonathan, approaching the camera with a rock in his hand, holding the same FU sign that Kenny found, leaning against the tree. So as it turned out, some suspicion had apparently been placed on Jonathan for some time at this point. Just like Gary, he had a reason to be looked into by police that was just purely routine, at least initially. He had been the first one to find Bobbie's body. And usually if something like that happens, police still want to vet you. They want to make sure that you weren't there because you were involved, and that's it. It's nothing new. It's nothing abnormal. It is just a routine procedure. But according to the family, Jonathan didn't take lightly to this. He immediately got himself a lawyer. He refused to cooperate with the police and answer any questions. They tried to get him to take a polygraph, and he denied that as well. He completely shut down, something that his family found extremely suspicious. And when you pair that with some of his history, they had even more reason to be concerned. Jonathan had a very long criminal history. He had always struggled with his behavior, and according to Ken, his mom had always come to his defense. Jonathan allegedly would steal from just about anyone, his friends, their family, his family. He would go to his dad's dealership and steal cars. He even broke into his mom's place of work, allegedly. He had stolen all sorts of things. He even stole a whole safe at one point, and when he couldn't get into it, he ultimately threw it in a river. And in 2007, around the time that his parents separated, he was formally charged with felony burglary. And it appears that his parents, despite having the money to do so, didn't bail him out for whatever reason. So this made authorities feel that maybe he started to harbor some sort of angry emotions toward one, if not both, of his parents. Now, around this time, Jonathan also, for some reason, filed a restraining order against his father, Gary. So there at least was some sort of tension with his father, and that is something that continues to this day. Jennifer and Jonathan also hadn't spoken for years before their parents got divorced. Again, I'm unsure why exactly, but it just seemed like there was just this cancerous growth within this family behind the scenes that had been going on for quite some time that no one knew about. But at this point, Jonathan seemed to pretty much only have his mom. Despite having a close relationship with his mom, clearly his family had reasons to think that he may have wanted to harm her. They've not been very clear about why, but police agreed with them. Police thought the same because in September of 2011, almost a year after her death, state police obtained a warrant to search both Jonathan's home and his car in relation to the murder of Bobbie. And not just that, it seems that they wanted to catch him by surprise because it was executed during a traffic stop. I mean, I don't know if that's just purely coincidental or if they were tailing him, but regardless, it tells me that they really wanted to look into him. And while nothing was released about what they found, if they were specifically looking for something, one bit of information did end up slipping through. They found a gun in his possession, magazines, and plenty of bullets. And the only reason this information slipped past the brick wall that authorities had put up around this case was because he was a felon. So he ended up being arrested for felony possession and he was thrown in jail. After he was released, he, for some reason, showed up at his dad's cabin. And I don't know if they were on good terms at this point or not. I'm assuming the latter because Gary was uncomfortable enough with this, and so was Ken, that they spoke about it and decided to call and report that Jonathan had broken the terms of his release by traveling to another state, since the cabin was in Maine. So for a second time, Jonathan was put in jail. And this time when they released him, he had an ankle monitor on, but still ended up getting in trouble for reckless driving around the anniversary date of his mother's death. Another family member also ended up coming forward, mentioning a very odd statement that Jonathan had said to them in the days after Bobbie had died. Jonathan said that he was supposed to see his mom that Halloween, the same day it's believed she was killed, because he told her he would bring her some screws, but he claimed he never went because he fell asleep. However, he then added that his friend ended up taking Bobbie the screws instead. This whole statement is really weird to me, okay? Because if he fell asleep, how did this random friend know to take his mom's screws? So let's say that he woke up and was like, oh crap, I forgot. What did he ask a random friend to go do it instead? Why wouldn't he just do it himself? Also, let's say he didn't wake up. What 20-something-year-old friend that just so happened to hear he had an errand to run to his mom to take screws would be like, oh man, he fell asleep. I guess I'll just do that for him. No way you twist it makes this seem very logical. It just becomes another point of frustration. And his family is frustrated because they don't know if he ever told police this. They don't know if the police ever spoke to this alleged friend. And that's huge because at minimum, this may have been the last person to see Bobbie before she was killed. What kind of information could they possibly have? Like, how did she seem when they saw her? Was there anyone else at the house? Was there someone strange around the neighborhood? There's just a lot that could potentially be answered if he was telling the truth. But at worst, this could also be a complete lie. And if so, why did he lie? Could all of this strange behavior just be his way of showing grief, or is there more to it? Apparently, This was enough for Gary and Ken to hire an attorney to start the process of slapping Jonathan with a wrongful death suit in regard to the death of his mother. And while many details and reasonings behind this decision have not been shared, one huge reason they wanted to do it was the hope of getting case files through discovery. As if this loss wasn't enough, the lack of answers and transparency was leading to turmoil, okay? Strained relationships within the family, obviously suspicion, mistrust. The investigation from the outside looking in seemed to be at a standstill, and the few things that were happening were locked up and out of reach. Bobbie's family was still getting the same generic response from authorities, if they could even reach them at all. So they hoped that during the discovery period in this wrongful death suit, that they would get their hands on case files to have some sort of answers. But unfortunately, the attorney pointed out that Murray's exemption would likely be used, and this wouldn't go the way that they had hoped. Now, I am sure that you all are very familiar with Mara Murray's disappearance. I don't think anyone that's been interested in true crime for even like a day has not heard about Mara Murray. But to kind of break it down very briefly, her family sued to have her case files released in order to get some movement in her case, and unfortunately, they lost. And in response to their attempt, New Hampshire passed something called Murray's exemption, which is just bewildering in and of itself that this is how the government responded. I digress. But basically, Murray's exemption would make it so that authorities were not forced to hand over documents through the Right to Know Act or a FOIA if it was an ongoing case. And obviously, it's much deeper than that. There's certain like stipulations. But while many people think that it is just to protect these cases and not a blanket exemption, I personally call absolute BS. I think it's just a loophole that is only harming these hundreds of families further. I'm all for the idea of protecting the integrity of investigations. I understand, like I said already in this video, why some things can't be shared, but when you start to hide behind that excuse to prevent accountability for your lack of actions amongst other things, I just think you're abusing your power at that point. So because of this and probably many more reasons that have not been shared, Bobbie's family decided not to pursue this wrongful death suit, and they were back to square one. At this point, years continued to pass, and communication with the Attorney General's office in charge of the now cold case was non-existent. So the family relied on their own efforts still to get answers. While $20,000+ was found at Bobbie's home, it was believed by family that she had more money in a safety deposit box at the bank. However, when that bank was checked, it was empty. So again, this raised quite a few questions and made it seem even more like this was very targeted and very planned out. Maybe someone didn't know that she had money kept in her home. They only knew about the safety deposit box. And so that is what they were really banking on. Bobbie's attorney also ended up coming forward saying that she had helped Bobbie rewrite her will just a week prior to her death. There were also claims that she might have been trying to increase her life insurance policy to $1 million, but never made it to the appointment. She had also just placed their old home in Wolfboro in a trust only like 2 or 3 days before her death. And while all of this could have been her finally arranging things because of pressure that was, put on by Gary, her just trying to tie up loose ends after the divorce before the next court hearing, some believe it was an indicator that she was scared something was about to happen to her. And then 2 years after the murder, there was another breakthrough that felt like it could be huge, but also added to the doubt that a proper investigation was done. The new owners of Bobbie's home ended up finding a shotgun shell in their yard. Authorities did come and retrieve it and even conducted a search of the area again, but I'm sure you can imagine how unsettling it is to know that one of the key pieces of evidence had potentially been left behind for years at this murder scene. Shotguns are incredibly loud and they do a lot of damage, and that is one of the reasons that they're not typically used in murders. You just don't see it as frequently. However, there is one reason why someone would want to risk being heard to use one. You cannot trace shotgun shells back to a specific shotgun. From my research and the knowledge that I have personally with guns, there is no traditional ballistic matching that can do this because the barrels of shotguns are smooth, and so they don't leave any identifiable grooves on the projectile or the shell. I have seen some argument that the firing pin and the ejector leaves a mark, but it still doesn't seem to have really helped anyone connect the two in forensics. On top of that, when you add the violent way that a shell leaves a shotgun, you really can't pull much data from it. The best you can do usually is identify the brand of the shell, but that's literally it. So while this was found, I doubt much unfortunately can come from it at this point, but it does leave me with a bunch of other questions that could have potentially narrowed things down. Like, how on earth did this shell end up outside? She was shot inside the house. The dog was shot inside of the house. Did the killer pull a Menendez brothers and pick the shells up before leaving and accidentally drop one in the yard? And then that makes me wonder, could there have been a fingerprint on it at some point from loading the gun or picking it up to clean up, and now that's just gone because it was missed? And it also made me really start to consider one potential theory that Bobbie's brother Ken had suggested immediately, pretty much after she was murdered, that this was possibly a hit. And when he said this, he initially was insinuating it may have been Gary, but he had suggested that someone hired someone else to do a hit. And that was my first thought when I heard about the crime scene and the 2 exact shots each, the fact that a shotgun was used because it's untraceable. There are just certain things about the crime scene that to me screamed that this was someone that knew what they were doing. Also, the fact that there were 2 shots is not quite overkill, but also is still more than was necessary. And to me, that's almost like a cleanup job, just to be sure, to make sure I fulfill this contract. I don't know. Personally, I don't think it's that out of the realm of possibilities that this was a hired hit for whatever reason. Again, maybe a business issue gone wrong. Did someone try to go and also hit Gary, and when that didn't happen, they just set his house on fire instead because he had already left? I mean, my wheels really started turning. Years continued to pass, and Bobbie's family, including Gary, still continued to fight for justice. They took her favorite hike up Mount Major and scattered her ashes. They remember her every year by making her favorite soup that they now call Bobbie soup on her birthday, and there should be a photo that you can save to make it on your own. They've also increased the reward to $55,000 and have put up billboards time and time again, hoping that it leads to tips.
You hope it gets solved in an hour like TV, and that doesn't happen. And at this point, we're just, looking for anyone that has any details from that weekend, no matter how small they think they are.
It's been nearly 7 years since Jennifer Miller got the call that her mother was dead, murdered in her own home on Halloween. The pain is still fresh.
I've already been through the worst day of my life. Nothing can ever be as bad as that, so.
Ken has also consistently spearheaded the efforts. He has rallied alongside dozens of other families to try and push the Attorney General's office that are now in charge of all these cold cases to do something about them, about the lack of communication with these families, the lack of attention. But it seems Ken and these other families just continue to be met still with empty promises and unanswered calls and emails. And it's really disappointing when I was watching all of the different bits of footage on the news, interviews with these different families, and then the statements that were made afterwards. And it seems like the Attorney General failed to be present and make himself known and listen to these families talk and what their concerns were. And instead, he would come in afterward in a very controlled setting and just say this statement, basically negating what these dozens of families are saying they are experiencing. From 2015 to 2023, the Attorney General's office didn't even have a cold case prosecutor. And I think it was 2018 that Ken stood up when they were having some sort of big government meeting and was like, you've not had a prosecutor for these cases for 3 years. And these people, these families that are relying on that, they don't know that. And this seemed to be one of the times where they did take accountability and say, yes, we're aware it's a problem, we're getting someone, but it still took from 2018 to 2023 to fill that position. Some of these families in New Hampshire were never even given a victim's advocate, and those that were have not found any sort of help with them. Ken has said that their family does have one. They were one of the lucky ones to get a victim's advocate, but their victim's advocate is either unreachable or tells them there's nothing new, and then ends the email with a really insensitive remark about enjoy your summer or hope you're having a great day, as if it's not almost been 2 decades of a living hell for them. He thinks that they are serving the AG office by being yet another barrier so they don't have to take accountability more than they're there for these hurting families, which is what their job is. If there was ever a case or a collection of cases to highlight the absolute crap way that victims and their families are treated after these crimes occur and when things go cold, this is it. How long can you get away with excusing people's concerns and requests for information by saying it's an ongoing case? When the case is cold and 30 years have passed for some of these people, how is that argument even still relevant? But they just continue to use it. So all these families are now fighting together to try and get some sort of action, some sort of answers from the AG. In 2023, Ken was outside of the AG's office with Julie Murray, Mara's sister, also with the victim of an uncaught serial killer who apparently, according to a statement, hasn't even been spoken to by anyone since it happened like 30 some years ago, and dozens of other families demanding answers. And I know that this particular video is about Bobbie, but when I saw all of them speak, I feel like it so accurately portrayed the gravity of the situation. Bobbie deserves so much more than that. Her family deserves so much more than that. Her mother is now 90 something years old and is still hoping every day to figure out what happened, to see the person that did this to Bobbie be put in prison. Bobbie deserves justice, as do all of these victims that are gathering dust on a shelf somewhere. I've said it before and I'll say it time and time again. The police have left room for the speculation. They have left room for the finger pointing. And as if losing Bobbie wasn't enough, now her family has been torn apart because of it. Everyone is at odds with what they believe because they're having to come up with their own answers from a few scraps of information that they have. That should never be left up to these families.
She had like the heartiest laugh, didn't she? Kenny, she laughed like all the time.
Bobbie's siblings, Mickey and Ken, say the most important thing to her was being a mom.
She lived for her 2 children. She did everything. Everything. She lived for her kids.
Everyone will tell you that their mom was the best, but yeah, she loved to do everything, and she always put her kids first.
For the past 12 years, Bobbie's family has been navigating through a nightmare, still grieving her loss while searching for clues in her case, one that with no leads or suspects has gone cold.
Did you ever think more than a decade later you'd still be in that same position as you were that night?
Absolutely not. No. Absolutely not. No.
Bobbie's family says the Attorney General's office was responsive and helpful after her murder, but as time went on, they claim the connection unraveled. Emails and inquiries are met with the same response.
You get a very generic answer. We have to protect the investigation.
How has that relationship been, at least for you and the Attorney General's office?
Yeah, non-existent.
The family frustrated by the lack of information and the lack of movement in the case.
Does it make you nervous that her name may remain on this cold case list for a long time?
Yeah, I don't even think, I don't even know if they're working on it.
Do we think it could be solved? Absolutely, it could be solved.
Yep.
Do we think it will be solved? Not unless something changes.
We have to do better by everyone, not just the victims of true crime, but the families that are also victims and are dealing with the aftermath of true crime all these years later. We have to hold these different departments accountable for making sure that enough is being done. It's so easy to look at the singular victim's name in a case like this, in a crime like this, and forget that there's so many other victims aside from that. And this case is one of those where I can just like tangibly feel everyone else's pain on top of Bobbie's. In my opinion, this case should have been solvable. Bobbie seemed like such an incredible person. It seems that she made an impact on everyone she came in contact with from the moment she was born on. She was just this endless energy and positivity and excitement and adventure. She just radiated loving life and never putting a time limit on herself. And it sucks that someone that's like that, which in my opinion is so rare, has been taken from this earth, taken from her family, taken from her friends, taken from her community. And the person that's responsible is out there probably just laughing, watching, and they're just getting away with it. I know that the Attorney General has come forward and said that they have looked into any new possible forensics to maybe do some retesting. I mean, this happened in 2010. Forensics were already in a pretty good place at that point. I don't even know if there's DNA in this case. I don't know if they found any of that. So I'm hoping all of this noise and continuing to talk about not just Bobbie's case, but several different cases in New Hampshire will hopefully spark a fire under the Attorney Generals to push them to do right by these families and solve these cases. On that note, I'm going to go ahead and go, you guys. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to Bobbie's story. If you're interested, you can go to the government website. I will have a link down below to look at all of the different cold cases that are still in New Hampshire. There's a whole list of all 130 some of them, and some of them are unbelievable, the details of them and how they're not solved. So it could definitely be a rabbit hole to fall down. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below to become a part of the Hallan fam so that we can hopefully bring them home together or bring them justice together. And I will see you guys in my next video.